Good morning. Today, in this lecture, we will take up William Blake's poem, London. This poem too appears in Blake's Songs of Experience, published in 1794. While the poems in the Songs of Innocence project the natural world full of innocence, beauty, and joy, the poems in this volume, that is Songs of Experience, represent, as David Dacius puts, not simply the corruption of innocence by the immoral forces of society, but show the inevitable distortion and sadness which systematized empirical philosophy imposes on life, and through which the road to the ultimate wisdom lies. Songs of Experience, he further remarks, are clearly the product of disillusion, however temporary, and present an overwhelmingly sad picture of what man has made of man. The poem, titled London, as is obvious from the title, is about the city of London at the turn of the century. It is a disenchanting picture of urban space, unhappiness, poverty, cruelty, hypocrisy, corruption of political and ecclesiastical institutions, exploitation of the weak and the vulnerable in the city. A short, simple, and straightforward poem, it is a telling comment on the social, economic, and political structure of the time. Let us first read the poem London. I wander through each chartered street, near where the chartered Thames does flow, and mark in every face I meet marks of weakness, marks of woe. In every cry of every man, in every infant's cry of fear, in every voice, in every ban, the mind-forged manacles I hear. How the chimney sweepers cry, every blackening church appalls, and the hapless soldier's sigh runs in blood down palace walls. But most, through midnight streets, I hear how the youthful harlot's curse blasts the newborn infant's tear and blights with plagues the marriage hearse. The poem, as you can see, is written in the first person narrative. While walking through the streets of London, Blake observes and is saddened by a number of things, by the signs of misery, of poverty, exploitation, and corruption. Let us now analyze the poem in detail and look at the words used in the poem and what they convey. The first stanza, the poet writes, I wander through each chartered street, near where the chartered Thames does flow. And let me here also point out that Blake later changed the word charter to dirty in the first two lines. But the poem that we are reading has the word chartered, so we'll go by that. And okay, so I wander through each chartered street. We assume that it is Blake himself walking around the streets of London. And look at the use of the verb wander in the present tense. The word effectively conveys that this is what London is like here and now at the time uh, when Blake is writing the poem. But then he goes on to use the word chartered. And the word wonder is sharply contrasted to the word chartered. Wonder suggests a freedom, an aimlessness or carelessness. The word chartered is its very opposite. Chartered means mapped out. A charter is a legal agreement that sets out who has what rights. Chartered streets then give the impression of restricted, bound. That is, the streets and the river Thames is bound in, restricted, controlled by the wealthy and the powerful, and that the ordinary citizens have no or limited rights and access. The natural rights of the people to the land and its resources are restricted by the laws made by the powerful and the prosperous. This was a huge issue in the industrialization of England, where peasants were ejected from the land as herding replaced farming in many areas, and people were forced into the cities to find work in restrictive, unnatural, overpopulated, and generally horrific conditions. Blackened walls later in the poem is also a reference to the marks of industrialization, to the dirt, to the soot of the London factories, blackening not only the walls of the buildings but also the lives of the people. This, sets the tone of the poem, as the reader is mentally prepared to hear more about the grim sights and sounds of London. As Blake walks around, he marks in every face I meet marks of weakness, marks of woe. Look at the word mark. Then he says, and mark in every face I meet. The word is used as a verb here, meaning to see, notice, observe. Observe what? Marks of weakness, marks of woe. Here marks is used as a noun, refers to signs of, symbols of, imprint of, images of. Images of what? Weakness, of woe. That is, wherever he goes, he notices signs of people's powerlessness, misery, sorrow, and suffering. The first stanza, then we see that it talks about the signs, the marks of suffering. The next three stanzas, you will notice, talk about the sounds he hears, the cries, the sighs, the curses, the blasts. And you see that there is a lot of repetition throughout the poem. Here too he says, in every cry of every man, in every infant's cry of fear, in every voice, in every ban, the mind-forged manacles I hear. The repetitive use of every to emphasize that wherever he goes, he witnesses the same scene, the same picture without any exception. The whole society is riddled by oppression, unhappiness, fear, Everyone seems to be helpless, defeated by the forces of power, wealth, and moreover have no idea as to how to change the situation. The poet also conveys that the people do not have the will and the strength to change things. They're totally dependent. In every voice, in every band, the mind-forged manacles I hear. The poet hears mind, the mind-forged manacles. That is, bonds which are made by mental attitudes. Manacles are like chains, handcuffs that imprison a person, that restrict a person's movement. But here, the poet is highlighting the mind-forged manacles, the mental shackles that confine, that constrict, and do not allow them to escape this life of drudgery and wretchedness. Also look at the word ban. Ban is an official ruling that states that something must not be done, shown, or used. That is, it refers to prohibition, restriction. What Blake here is highlighting is that both the rulers and the ruled have imposed social and intellectual restrictions on themselves and continue to be trapped in a cycle of dependency and suffering. Let us move to the third stanza. How the chimney sweepers cry, every blackening church appalls, and the hapless soldier's sigh runs in blood down palace walls. These lines comment on the then prevalent child labor, the corruption in the church, the army, and the monarchy. These lines refer first to how small children are made to work, quite often forced to work by parents who desperately need the money. In my earlier lecture, I had read out both the Chimney Sweeper, the poems titled The Chimney Sweeper, published in the Songs of Innocence and Experience. Listen to that again, or just go online and look for the poems and read them again, and you will see what the poet is trying to tell you. Chimney sweepers were usually young boys forced to climb and clean chimneys, putting themselves in grave danger in return for some food and a place to sleep. And these poor, malnourished, small children are robbed of their childhood, of their youth, of their innocence. They're covered with soot, many a times crippled, and many a times dying a tragic death. Blake further says, every blackening church appalls. What is it that appalls the church? The chimney sweeper's cry. Why? And this is not just a pointer. The blackening church is not just a pointer to the impact of industrialization, but shows the dehumanizing of the church, which is supposed to protect the weak and the vulnerable. The church has turned a blind eye and deaf ear to the cries of the young chimney sweepers. That is, it has failed to protect them. The poet is referring to the moral blackening of the church. This can be seen as a criticism of organized religion and its failure to provide for the disadvantaged members of society. It connotes dismay, horror, and reflects the lack of action of the church, which should offer support and help to the poor, but is focused more on its own wealth. The church, as the poet further says, is not the only body that is responsible for suffering around him. He also places the blame on the palace. He criticizes those in power for wars and the bloodshed, where again it is the hapless soldier, the unlucky soldier who bears the brunt, who are pushed into war and have no choice but to serve their country. The speaker imagines their blood running down the walls of a palace. It is a powerful image, signifying the unfortunate soldier's sacrifice to protect the power of those who live in the palaces. It is a symbolic metaphor. Sigh implies that the soldiers are resigned to their death, as they have no say, as they have no choice. The fourth and the final stanza suggests that the most pervasive and frequently heard sounds on London streets is the sound of a young mother who is also a prostitute, cursing her newborn infants, crying and blighting with plagues the marriage hearse. The poet writes, "But most through midnight streets I hear how the youthful harlot's curse blasts the newborn infant's tear and blights with plagues the marriage hearse." Harlots is a slang for prostitutes or low-class women. Blake is corrupting the idea of childbirth with sexual exploitation and hate. Curse. The newborn infant is born into a broken world. He is doomed to darkness from the very beginning. Those in power have chosen not to help these women, and therefore they've been left with no option but to turn to prostitution to survive. And the child is surrounded by cursing, so their innocence is lost. And a young woman could be cursing those in power, her life, or the unwanted child. And let me also tell you that at that time, child mortality rates were very high. The use of the oxymoron, marriage hearse, in the last line is very suggestive. Hearses are for funerals, not weddings. Hearse is a funeral car used to carry a coffin. Blake, marriage should be a celebration of love and the beginning of new life. Here, however, it is combined with the word hearse, a vehicle associated with funerals, suggesting the sanctity of the marriage is destroyed as the marriage bed is corrupted by fatal disease. It is not only a comment on marriage, but on the city itself, where young girls are exploited, are corrupted, and whose illegitimate children are left to fend for themselves, whose childhood is completely destroyed from the moment they are born. The poet exposes how power and corruption attack and destroy innocence. The poet hears the youthful harlot's curse. This is indicative of the level of poverty and corruption, of helplessness. That a young girl has to get involved in prostitution, and the suffering of this young woman makes her curse the innocent newborn baby. The use of the violent word like blasts conveys effectively the ruin of innocence, of purity. And blights with plagues the marriage hearse, telling how the harlot's curse blights, mars, or marks the institution of marriage. The reference is to death by transmitted diseases. The powerful words blasts, blights, plagues hint at the destruction of all that is good in the society. The physical, moral, and spiritual decay as a result of urbanization, industrialization, poverty, corruption, war, oppressive political and religious institutions. So the poem sums up the whole picture of the society of the time by describing the city of London and the miserable condition of the people there. So I'll stop here and we'll talk about the language and the structure and the symbols and theme, etc. of the poem later. Good day.